Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Jason had never placed his faith in tidy, clean-cut deaths, especially not the kind wrapped in ceremony and closure. The world he came from didn't allow for such finalities. Death was often used as a tool, a disguise, a trap. And for someone like Britt, who had danced so long on the edge of chaos and brilliance, her end had always felt too neat, too silent, too unconvincing. The memory of that moment in the Paris airport kept replaying in his mind with obsessive clarity, the subtle flicker of recognition in a passing glance, the sudden pause of footsteps amidst the crowded terminal, and the shiver that cut through his spine like ice. It wasn't just the ghost of longing that haunted him, it was the unmistakable instinct of a man who had seen too much to dismiss a living ghost. Britt had looked back, even if for a fraction of a second. And that was enough. Returning to Port Charles with his mind unsettled and his soul ignited, Jason knew there was no peace until he could either find Britt or confirm, without question, her fate. When he brought up her name to Liesel, the mother who had long accepted her daughter's supposed death, he watched a tremor ripple through her composure. Liesel, normally sharp-tongued and unflinching, became still. It wasn't grief that passed through her eyes, but something more telling, hope laced with dread. There was something in Jason's tone, in his unwavering certainty, that triggered the same maternal intuition that had once convinced Liesel her daughter would outlive the worst. And now, with Jason insisting they exhume Britt's grave, that same intuition told her this was not madness. This was reckoning. Liesel had never been one to shy away from the grotesque, but the thought of digging up her daughter's grave wasn't merely grotesque, it was unbearable. And yet, if Britt was alive, if the woman she had buried was a lie, then the pain of unearthing that coffin was nothing compared to the torment of letting the truth rot in silence. Jason, relentless and focused, knew the stakes. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. That's why he turned to Elizabeth, not just because of her position at the hospital, but because she had once stood on the edge of shadows herself. Elizabeth, the quiet keeper of hospital secrets, was the one person who could trace the threads of the night Britt was declared dead. She had seen the morgue reports, the gaps in protocol, the strange absences and the falsified forms that no one else had questioned. She didn't need Jason to spell it out. His presence, his urgency, and that hardened look in his eyes told her what she feared she already knew. Something about Britt's death hadn't added up. And now, too many years later, the cracks in the story had widened into a canyon. As Jason and Liesel approached the cemetery in the haze of a pale morning, where fog hung like breath held too long, they knew they weren't just revisiting the past. They were preparing to rip it open. The first plunge of the shovel broke the silence with a sickening thud, as if disturbing something that should have remained buried. Each shovelful of dirt felt like a challenge to fate, to every lie ever told and accepted. When at last they lifted the coffin lid, the world held its breath. There was no body. No trace. Just an empty void lined with satin and betrayal. Liesel fell to her knees, not in sorrow, but in fury. Her fingers clenched around Jason's arm as if holding on to the one anchor in a sea of deceit. For that one instant, they weren't grieving, they were awakening. But the question loomed larger than ever. Why would Britt fake her death, and who would help her do it? Had she been forced? Had she made a deal? Why Paris? And more importantly, why now? Was the brief glimpse in the airport a calculated risk on Britt's part, a final cry for help from behind the curtains of some invisible prison? Jason's instincts screamed that Britt hadn't run to hide. She had been hidden, perhaps manipulated, possibly drugged, and almost certainly watched. He retraced every name that had touched Britt's story before she vanished: hospital administrators, WSB contacts, associates of Liesel, even enemies she had once bested. And slowly, a web began to form, connecting Britt's disappearance to a series of unusual donations made in her name, a dormant medical foundation that had suddenly become active again, and cryptic late-night calls received by Liesel asking for genetic information under the guise of research. Someone was keeping Britt alive, but not for her benefit. She had become valuable, not as a person, but as a commodity. Jason's rage simmered beneath the surface, not out of romantic longing, but out of loyalty to a woman who had risked everything to help him once. He owed her more than mourning. He owed her the truth. As he dug deeper, more inconsistencies emerged. Blood samples sent from an unknown lab bearing Britt's genetic markers, reports of a woman matching her description admitted briefly to a private clinic in Berlin, and a series of encrypted communications that, once decoded, pointed to a clandestine facility known only through whispers among the intelligence underworld. A place where lives were paused, identities rewritten, and secrets held for ransom. Liesel, meanwhile, began revisiting her old contacts from her days on the periphery of science and espionage. Her guilt mounted with every revelation. Had she, in her arrogance and control, placed Britt in harm's way? Had Britt stumbled onto something she shouldn't have, something so dangerous it necessitated her erasure? The mother in her couldn't stand still. Every fiber of her being burned with the need to bring her daughter home. Now Jason, Liesel, and Elizabeth formed a strange alliance. The soldier, the scientist, and the nurse, each drawn into a storm that had been hidden in plain sight. Port Charles carried on, oblivious, unaware that beneath its calm surface, a war for truth had begun. And at its center was a woman presumed dead, but now known to be alive, somewhere out there, watching, waiting, surviving. Jason would not rest. Not until he looked Britt in the eyes and knew she was free. Not until every lie that bound her was shattered. And if the world insisted on keeping her hidden, then he would burn down every wall until there was nowhere left to hide. Because for Jason, death was never the end, it was just another illusion waiting to be destroyed. Jason Morgan's crusade to uncover the truth behind Britt's supposed death had evolved into something far more than a search. It was now a brutal reckoning with the shadows that had long manipulated fate behind closed doors. As he ventured deeper into the conspiracy that swallowed Britt, he resurrected old contacts from every corner of his dark past. These were not just casual acquaintances, they were men and women who had witnessed bodies disappear, files rewritten, and lives reprogrammed in the name of science, power, and silence. Many of them owed Jason favors, lifelong debts forged in blood and betrayal, and now, he was calling them in, one by one. From the bowels of GH's back corridors to dimly lit warehouses on the outskirts of Port Charles, Jason pieced together a chilling truth. Britt's death had been orchestrated, not by a mad killer, but by something much colder, an organization that operated in the cracks between legitimate medicine and weaponized biology. He discovered mentions of an entity known only by whispers as the Accord, a conglomerate of rogue scientists, former WSB operatives, and corporate funders who had been quietly conducting human experiments for over a decade. Their aim was terrifying in its ambition: extend human life, control neural function, eliminate free will, and their subjects were chosen for both brilliance and vulnerability. Britt, as the daughter of Liesel and the legacy of Faison's genetic code, had been marked from the beginning. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's quiet investigation bore fruit more insidious than either of them expected. While combing through digital archives and backups long thought erased, she found files heavily encrypted and labeled under misclassified autopsy codes. Upon decrypting them, with Spinelli's assistance, she unearthed a timeline that didn't match the public record of Britt's death. The blood transfusion request bearing Britt's rare AB-negative type had been just the beginning. There were also transport logs for a patient transferred out of GH under an alias, on the same night Heather Weber supposedly murdered Britt. That patient's biometric data, weight, height, blood oxygen levels, matched Britt's perfectly. Elizabeth also uncovered camera footage from a rear corridor, never aired or discussed, showing a woman being wheeled out under heavy sedation. The face was obscured, the timestamp conveniently corrupted. But the wrist, the one visible detail, wore a medical bracelet bearing Britt's date of birth. The footage was time-stamped just 1 hour after the hospital declared her dead. Jason took this evidence and cross-referenced it with customs data from airports throughout Europe, focusing on flights leaving New York within the next 12 hours. He found one private jet. Registered under a shell corporation connected to a pharmaceutical conglomerate with former ties to Liesel, that landed in Geneva. A woman fitting Britt's description had boarded under the name Dr. Weiss. The trail continued from there, growing colder with each stop, Budapest, Zurich, then finally a remote alpine research facility officially abandoned during a scandal over unlicensed human trials. But Jason knew better. The facility had simply gone underground, rebranded, and restarted under a new front. At the same time, Jason received word from one of his more dangerous connections, a former black market organ broker who now dealt in medical intelligence, that several of Britt's patients had been tracked and monitored years after her disappearance. Most had no idea they were being followed. One, however, had died under mysterious circumstances just weeks earlier after reporting harassment by men in lab coats claiming to be conducting routine health evaluations. The broker shared one final clue, a digital key to a vault deep in the WSB's restricted archives. Jason risked everything to acquire it, breaking into a secure server farm under the radar, and what he found made his blood run cold. Project Helix. The files contain detailed research into neurological conditioning, cryostasis revival, and genetic data linked to several individuals thought to be deceased, including Britt. There were images, grainy and distorted, of Britt restrained, sedated, monitored. The dates were current. She wasn't just alive. She was imprisoned. Monitored like a specimen. Used. Liesel, seeing this, transformed into something even more terrifying than the brilliant doctor she once was. She became a force of vengeance cloaked in maternal fury. She contacted surviving elements of her old network in Prague and Munich, gathering a small but lethal circle of allies. Former intelligence agents, unlicensed surgeons, and loyalists from the old WSB days, they all rallied under a single mission: get Britt back. Even Elizabeth, who had long stayed clear of such moral ambiguity, now found herself willing to bend every oath she had ever sworn. This wasn't about medicine anymore. It was about justice. Spinelli managed to intercept a live communication ping from a device known to be used within Project Helix's inner circle. The signal originated not in Europe, but shockingly in the US, a hidden facility buried beneath a private psychiatric retreat just outside Rochester, camouflaged under mental health protections and owned by a trust linked to the same conglomerate funding the accord. Satellite imagery showed movement in and out, but no civilian access. Infrared signatures revealed a sublevel with heavy shielding, likely containing labs or isolation chambers. Jason didn't wait. Armed with the truth and driven by the unrelenting knowledge that Britt had been screaming in silence all this time, he prepared an assault. He recruited 2 former WSB field operatives who owed him their lives, along with an ex-Navy SEAL turned private contractor. The plan was clean, fast, and absolute: infiltrate, extract, destroy all traces. But Jason knew, deep down, that what he would find might not be the Britt he remembered. The rescue was chaos incarnate. Smoke, alarms, security scrambling to hide their sins. When Jason finally reached the chamber where Britt was kept, his heart nearly stopped. She lay inside a transparent stasis pod, her body pale, wires embedded into her skin, her heartbeat faint but strong. Monitors flashed symbols in languages not used in medicine but in military code. She was alive, but kept in suspended consciousness, her mind trapped in a manipulated dream state. Jason's hand trembled as he disconnected the systems, each wire removed a promise of freedom. As he cradled her in his arms, she murmured, just one word, his name. But even then, they were not safe. Explosives planted by the rogue scientists triggered a collapse, and Jason barely escaped with Britt, wounded but alive. The facility burned, but the knowledge it held would echo forever. The aftermath would bring questions from authorities, investigations buried, and survivors silenced. Liesel vanished, taking with her stolen files as leverage. Elizabeth returned to the hospital, her conscience forever altered. And Jason, sitting by Britt's side as she slowly healed, knew this was only the beginning. Because what had been done to Britt could be done to anyone. And someone, somewhere, was still watching. Still experimenting. Still playing God. And Jason Morgan, now more than ever, was ready to bring that God to his knees. While the everyday rhythms of Port Charles continued, children off to school, nurses exchanging shifts at General Hospital, lovers meeting in cafes and enemies circling in boardrooms, something was brewing beneath the surface that none of them could see. A secret was unraveling, one so dangerous, so fundamentally destabilizing, that if exposed, it would not only upend the lives of a few individuals, but shake the very foundation of trust in medicine, security, and identity within the town. The trio at the center of this silent storm, Jason, Liesel, and Elizabeth, had, through their determination and loss, uncovered something so profound that it turned the concept of death on its head. The discovery of Britt's empty grave wasn't just a revelation. It was a warning, a siren in the dark that something monstrous had been orchestrated in secret. For Jason, that empty coffin didn't symbolize closure, it was a battlefield. It screamed of manipulation, deception, and power so twisted it could manufacture death without a corpse. The world had mourned Britt. They had whispered her name in past tense, turned her legacy into eulogy, and yet, beneath all of that grief, she had been out there, forgotten by the living, used by the shadows. The town of Port Charles didn't notice the subtle tremors that had begun to build. Not yet. But Jason, Liesel, and Elizabeth knew a reckoning was coming. The truth they were assembling was like a fuse stretching back to the heart of every institution in the city, GH, the WSB, and possibly even the private elite who pulled strings from their estates in upstate New York. And the fuse had already been lit. Jason's obsession was no longer just about Britt. It had become about justice, autonomy, and identity. Someone had erased Britt from the world. And if they could do it to her, they could do it to anyone. He had seen the implications clearly. Project Helix wasn't about one woman. It was a template. A prototype for a broader scheme to rewrite people's lives, manipulate memory, hijack genetics, and bend science into a weapon of control. And Britt? She wasn't just a victim. She was the key. Each step Jason took toward her recovery came at a cost. The deeper he pushed, the more eyes turned toward him, cold, calculating eyes from men in suits who never appeared on public record, from medtech executives who visited Port Charles under the guise of philanthropy. The city's normalcy was a mask. And behind that mask was a silence that had swallowed dozens, maybe hundreds, of lives just like Britt's. Jason had ripped that mask open. And now, the town unknowingly stood on a precipice. Elizabeth, whose hands had once only healed, now worked in the shadows of her profession. She used hospital access not just to save lives, but to expose what had been hidden behind false autopsy reports, buried records, and locked doors. Her loyalty to the hospital had been replaced by something fiercer, loyalty to the truth. She knew too well how easily trust could be betrayed in sterile corridors. Liesel, once feared for her ruthless mind, had evolved into something more formidable than a scientist. She was a mother wronged, armed with intellect and fury. She had stopped shedding tears the moment she saw Britt's empty grave and started mapping a war plan instead. Through coded messages, encrypted files, and contacts no longer considered official, she gathered everything she needed to dismantle the organization that had taken her daughter. Yet even with all the intel, all the resources, one question still haunted Jason more than any other: why? Why Britt? Why would someone want her removed from the world? Was it because of her father's legacy, Faison's DNA, and the dark brilliance it carried? Or was it something deeper? Had Britt uncovered something she shouldn't have, something so dangerous that removing her was the only option those in power could justify? Jason's mind churned through every possibility. Each scenario more terrifying than the last. But even as the danger mounted and the stakes rose, he remained unshaken. He had faced death 1,000 times. He had lived in exile, lost his family, buried his identity more times than most people could survive. But Britt had made him feel human again. In the final weeks before her disappearance, she had seen the man behind the scars, the protector, the silent warrior, the man who, for once, wanted peace. That was a gift he would never forget. And now, it was a debt he intended to repay with fire. With every step forward, Jason found new layers of betrayal. Old allies became suspects. Medical institutions once thought noble revealed corruption so deep it was practically encoded in their foundations. Still, the city above remained unaware. Mayor's speeches continued. Board meetings proceeded. Couples planned weddings, and funerals were held with pomp and illusion. But beneath the polished veneer, Port Charles was being hollowed out by a secret too grotesque to comprehend. Jason knew that the war he was waging wasn't just for Britt's freedom, it was for the soul of the city itself. Because if truth could be buried so easily, if a person's death could be manufactured and accepted without scrutiny, then no one was truly safe. Any loved one, any friend, could be erased. And the terrifying part? No one would question it. They would light a candle. Say a prayer. Move on. That cycle had to end. Jason's hands were steady, but his heart burned like wildfire. And that fire fueled him through sleepless nights, through locked server rooms and dangerous confrontations with men whose silence had been purchased long ago. Every door he kicked open, every secret he exposed, was a promise to Britt. That no matter how deep they buried her, he would dig her out. No matter how long they had tried to silence her, he would give her a voice again. But Jason also knew the closer he got, the more he would have to sacrifice. His life. His safety. His name. All of it might be lost before Britt took her first step back into the light. And still, he didn't hesitate. Because he wasn't fighting just as a man in love.